Welcome to Lupine Genomics, my series where I talk about the literary aspects of Gene Wolfe's writing. We often talk in Gene Wolfe circles about his sort of the meaning of his books, the themes, and things that can be approached in different ways, but are really a big part of the appeal for lots of people who like Gene Wolfe is just like what's going on in this book. But we don't as often talk, I think, about how he does it, techniques, literary approaches. And this is a bit like the difference between discussing, and I've done it on this channel, Tom Bombadil as a world building question. Who is Tom Bombadil? Where is he from? Versus saying what is Tolkien's literary purpose for Tom Bombadil. So I talked last time about why you do a series like this. Now I want to talk about, let's call this style part one, basic stuff, basic form, because style actually includes lots of different things, doesn't it? Style could be said to include the big question of narration in Wolfe to do with reliability and voice and things like that. It could be said that it's to do with the way he uses quotation or say just format. So epistolary, like in The Sorcerer's House, or like a history being written, as in Short Sun or New Sun, particularly, are kind of openly, explicitly histories being written in a particular way, or it could be, the internal narration of something like Peace. These are all elements of style which are separate from the exact themes, the exact plot, though they may be informed. The reason he may have chosen them may be because they're a plot. Oh, another good example, Pandora by Holly Hollander has the device of being a detective novel. So you have all these sort of elements of style, but there's a very basic part of style, which is just how does he write the dash things? Like what is his writing like? And I did talk about this on my Substack, and I want to expand the conversation I had there about his style. This is two quotes from Wolfe, which one is from very early in his career, 1972, and one is in the latter middle part, 27 years later, 1999. He wrote for another 20 years or so, just basically until he died, with his last novel coming out posthumously. And these are the two I compared there to try to talk about the way in which he communicates and also the way in which his style develops. And this is one part of his style developing. And now you might think these are very selective quotes. No, I've gone for two books, and I've only gone for some quotes within those books. And I'm going to address some of the wider issues about how style changes in Wolfe, including later in his career, and also sometimes within the same book. So give me time now, but let's just talk about these two to start with. So his first real novel, in his own view, his breakout novel, Fifth Head of Cerberus. 3 novellas touching interconnecting themes. One of the places someone might start reading Wolfe. The narrator, number 5, says, "To the west, since it was taller than the surrounding houses and marked by the orange trees on the roof, I could make out our house. To the south, to the masts of the ships in the harbour, and in clear weather, if it was the right time of day, the white caps of the tidal race St. Anne drew between the peninsulas called First Finger and Thumb. And once, as I very well recall, while looking south, I saw the great gazer of sunlit water when a star-crosser splashed down. To east and north spread the city proper, the citadel, and the grand market in the forests and mountains beyond." Here, the narrator 5 is describing from the roof of the local library, from the cupola, that is to say, he is describing his city, what he can see. 27 years later, Sinew came back with the telescope. I asked whether he wanted the first look, and he sneered at me. It was always a mistake to try to treat him with any courtesy in those days, and I could have kicked myself for it. I put the telescope to my eye, wondering what Sinew was doing the second I could no longer watch him. Now, of course, I think there's a bit that does sound like the same author, but these are very different, I think. And there are many possible reasons they're different. But functionally, we can say that the biggest reason they are different is that in the late 80s, Wolfe was basically told that he had to compress his style. Or that is to say, he had to get stuff done quicker, or he had to write in a tighter way. And it's interesting because I'm not sure if that quite happened. But he talks about this in an interview. I think there's an interview maybe at the University of Michigan and some other places where he talks about whether it's his audience, whether it was the editors saying you must write in a more compressed manner. And you see with Fifth Head of Cerberus here and his other big early book or books, the 4 books of Book of the New Sun, he writes in a quite rich style. Peace as well, his great kind of ghostish novel, which is one of my favourite Wolfe books, also from the 70s. And in these books he writes in with incredibly rich style, and this is part of what's so enjoyable about them. By rich style I mean as in he has very luxuriant language. He kind of communicates a world in quite vivid colours. It's it's got fat on the bones in a good way, not a bad way. By the time we get to Book of the Short Sun, Volume 1 on Blues Waters, we have a very spare style. And I'll talk about why a little bit more. But we have a very spare style. And this starts, I think, more or less with the writing of the Book of the Long Sun in the late 80s, early 90s. And it is visible in, though it's not quite fully there, with his short books of the late 80s. I'm thinking particularly Castle View and Pandora by Holly Hollander, both of which I quite like, against the grain perhaps amongst Wolfe fans. But yes, let's just make sure we have something to draw with. So we see to the west, since it was taller, so we've got we've got a directional instruction, and then we have a comparative and a relative, and talking the description of his house, orange trees on the roof. To the south, the master ships in harbour, and in clear weather if it was the right time of day. So 2 qualifiers, the white caps of the tidal race St Andrew between the peninsulas, and once, as I very well recall, while looking south, the great gazer of sunlit water when a star-crosser splashed down. To east and north spread the city proper, the citadel and the grand market, and the forests and mountains beyond. So there are several adjectives, just quite hot adjectives, strong adjectives, sunlit, great. They may or may not be exciting adjectives, but they are kind of quite strong and robust, and lots of other comparatives, lots of other descriptive words. What is happening here? What's happening? Well, the main bit of information we get, other than a bit of geography, we get some geography from the top of the library. You can see the harbour to the south and the peninsula, and to the west you can see his house, the orange trees on the roof, where a fairly important scene happens at one point, and east and north the city, and the city and the grand market, and the forest mountain beyond. And so there's some sense in which this gives us geography that maybe matter for the book, but it's not incredibly important. You get a bit of information about star crosses as a phrase for possibly spaceships, and they land sort of Spelljammer style, or Royal Cinnabar Navy by David Drake style. They land on water to come into dock. So that's a bit of world building, which is kind of one of those things which, though it may not be immediately plot relevant, gives us probably an important sense of how the world works. But there's not very much that happens in the passage, but it's fairly long for that. It's eight lines, 7 and a bit lines, and it has a lot of descriptors. Here, Sinew came back with a telescope. Event. So, we'll mark that E. I asked whether he wanted the first look. So, dialogue. And it's an event, isn't it? Something that's happening. And he sneered at me. Event. Call it dialogue. It was always a mistake to try to treat him with any courtesy in those days, and I could have kicked myself for it. Character. And I could have kicked myself for it. Also, character tells us something about the narrator. I put the telescope to my eye, wondering what Sinew was doing the second I could no longer see him. So, event, character. You can see here, this is mostly, let's call it description. And of course, the cheating thing here that may seem cheap is, of course, on Blues Waters has some slightly more descriptive passages, and of course, Fifth Head Cerberus has plenty of much more plot central passages. That's not really the point, as I'm not saying that he didn't know how to write a plot early on. He did, or dialogue early on. He did. But there is something happening here that there's a lot of stuff that happens here. A conversation happens. We have the movement of he gets the telescope and he looks, because that's important for him to look. And we also get character development for both him and Sinew in all of this. This is very efficient at telling us stuff. And the striking thing is that this happens in 4 lines, and essentially, and there are no descriptive adjectives, basically. First is an ordinal. It's not a descriptor. He sneered at me. It was always a mistake to treat them with any courtesy in those days. In those days is not an adjective, but obviously it's a sort of descriptor, it's a qualifier. Again, only relating to defining a quality, a particular time quality. It also implies development. Let's put that as dev. We know that he's potentially going to be different because of this, or he was different before this. And I could have kicked myself for it. I put a telescope to my eye, wondering what Sinew was doing the second I could no longer watch him. We have something very strong about the relationship between these two characters. We have something about what's going to happen in the books. We have, plot happening as he's, albeit it's a small thing, he's looking through the telescope. And it all happens without basically any descriptive adjectives. Whereas here, there's a very beautiful passage that I really enjoy in Fifth Head. And as I say, I like this early descriptive style. So, and one thing people like about Book of the New Sun, that sometimes people like, is how rich, how Christmas cake it is. Not just all the kind of mad, made-up words or borrowed words, but also the richness of the narrative and the description and the world and so on. And that's part of the style that gets pared down by the time we get to this. This is very spare. But you can see that what he's learned, and it's not that this is bad, as I say, I really like Fifth Head Cerberus, but you see that he goes from having very even middle-length sentences with a sort of normal number of descriptors, but is just very limpid, fluid prose, which gives a good description of the world as he's unfolding these interesting plots, to this very spare, angular prose almost. Not quite angular, but let's say almost angular. Just a little bit jagged, just a little bit sharp at points. And maybe sharp rather than jagged. And he has got to the point where he is pouring out information. This is so dense in information. This is much more like Christmas cake, in fact, than this in terms of its density, if not in its sweetness. So there are many styles in Wolfe, and one of those things is, let's call it diachronic, between times. Comparing 2 times, you see his style develop, and I think you can prefer one or the other. I like both. They're different reasons. I think it means some of his early books are easier to read, in terms of there's less going on. They're a bit more sweet to the taste. And you don't have to be quite as practiced with him. Whereas later on you are beginning to deal with koans, and that is quite fun, but it requires a more ambitious postulant. Now, it's not one-way traffic, though, between 1972 and 1999. But let's look at a 2010 novel, The Sorcerer's House. Here we have, it's a letter novel, epistolary novel, and it is it's a novel. A guy is writing letters to people, so each chapter is a letter, and he talks to various people. Now here he's sending a letter. This is the first letter, and I think he's just left prison. No job yet, and none in sight. I'll try somewhere else, but I cannot afford a bus ticket until my allowance comes. Not that I am flat. Not yet. I'm going to try to get my brother to front me some money if I can. He owes me not one damned thing, but he has plenty, and 300 or 400 right now would mean the world to me. This is again quite spare. You have that one descriptor, and it's a very seemingly quite character-based descriptor, damned. Now, there are other sort of semi-descriptive things mean the world to me. Sorry, that is a excess that. Ignore that. So yeah, there's some sort of slightly descriptive language, but they're not adjectives qualifying nouns. That's a particular thing we're tracking here. And so here we seem to have a continuation that you've got quite a lot of information here. No job yet and none in sight. That is, in fact, basically, let's call that its character, and it's it's plot, it's setup, isn't it? I would try somewhere else, but I cannot afford a bus ticket, and my allowance comes. We have information about the allowance. So that is also kind of character plot. Not that I am flat, not yet. I'm going to try to get my brother to front me some money if I can. He has a brother. Again, that's character. He owes me not one damn thing, but he has plenty. And 3 or 400 right now would mean the world to me. So we learn 2 things. He's rich. So character for the second character, the brother. We also get an implicit character here of Shell, who he's writing to. And then also that he doesn't owe me anything. There's not a good relationship with his brother, so that is also a character thing. Here we again have a lot communicated in very few words. It seems like, without saying, oh well, he couldn't ever be efficient in fifth head sober, as he often is, but he can do this excellent job of communicating so much in so few lines. But here is another very early passage, I think, I think this is like letter 4 or 5 from the Sorcerer's House. Most impressive was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a full beard, who was crowned like a king, and his crown gleamed in the moonlight. He danced stiffly, but with great dignity, keeping time, as I saw, to music I could not hear. Beside him danced a Juno-esque woman nearly as tall as he. She wore a long gown and many jewels, and there was something beautiful and mysterious in her dance. I longed to see her more closely and to follow the intricacies of it. With him danced a lean, capering fellow who seemed all arms and legs, a dwarf with the face of an ape, and a half-naked girl with flying hair, and others I find I cannot recall distinctly. So, this is very different. This is the same apparent author writing to someone different. A relevant thing is he's writing to a different person, and this brings us into some of those other questions that we're not going to talk about today, but big wolf questions of narrative voice. And it's certainly relevant. You read Book of the New Sun versus Pandora by Holly Hollander versus Wizard Knight versus Book of the Long Sun versus Sorcerer's House. Say, and you have all these different voices, all these different narrative techniques from the narrators, and then you add in the rare third, most of them are first person, the rare third person narrative like Castleview, where I guess it's Gene Wolfe telling you the story, it seems. So this brings us into an area we won't discuss today, but it shows there's an adaptability of the writing style. Here he's writing to, our narrator is writing to an ex-con. It's very simple, it's very direct, it's lots of slang, and this leads us to references, another whole area of, Lupine genomic stylistic discussion is how he references and uses dialect and specialist vocabulary. An obvious example there, the most obvious example, infamous almost, is the Book of the New Sun. But here, it's very slangy, it's very direct, it's very simple. Here, it's much more descriptive. It's not too complex here. There are a few moments where the narrator will use more complex words. But one thing that certainly still strikes us perhaps is how direct it is. But nonetheless, lots of descriptors. Most impressive, maximal. Tall, broad-shouldered man, full beard. Simile, crowned like a king. So he was crowned like a king, not just crowned. And his crown gleamed in the moonlight. He danced stiffly, but with great dignity, keeping time, as I saw, to music I could not hear. That very powerful image. Beside him danced a Juno-esque woman, matronly but beautiful, nearly as tall as he, comparator. She wore a long gown, many jewels. There was something beautiful and mysterious in her dance. I longed to see her more closely and to follow the intricacies of it. With them danced a lean, capering fellow who seemed, all arms and legs, a dwarf with the face of an ape. That is a descriptor, and it's one of those very basic descriptors. You can't quite get away from that, even in a very spare style. You'll end up saying the tall man, the dark-skinned man, the man with the gun. You will, of course, have qualifications like that, even in a very spare style. But I think this is not that. This is a dwarf with the face of an ape. It's a poetic image, even if it's also literal, and a half-naked girl with flying hair, and others I find I cannot recall distinctly. So this is a world apart stylistically from both the other Sorcerer's House quote here we have and on Blues Waters. And I think part of what we can see there is that there is development between 1972 and 1999, and he talks about it himself. We can see he retains that capacity for communication into the Sorcerer's House, how dense that first letter is, that paragraph of the first letter is, despite using no descriptors, apart from damned. And is damned a descriptor? Sort of not really, it is, but it's an emphasis. But then he has this very different thing, which is much more similar, we think, to the fifth head of Cerberus. So one thing we can say is that he developed his style, and then he practiced and was able, in Sorcerer's House, to use multiple voices very well. And it's an interesting thing is that, generally speaking, basically Wolfe doesn't tend to use multiple narrators. There are exceptions to that. But he is not he's not writing Hyperion. And he's not writing Game of Thrones, which is a limited third-person perspective where you have very much a narrative voice per character, that sort of thing. And there are other, Robin Hobb does the same as Game of Thrones. So neither is it the direct speech of the Canterbury Tales, where you have characters speaking and then telling you a tale which at some level represents their character as well, nor do you have the limited knowledge. In most of these, their cast view is different for that, because that is third person and does have a limited third person narrative perspective. But generally speaking, it's a single first person narrator. And most of these examples, even sometimes that's complicated, but usually in most of these books, it is the case that that's what he's doing. Here, he's showing that even when he's doing that, he can use different voices. That points us to that discussion at a later date. But also, this is still very, very dense. And I say this again, it's not that there are not very dense passages in Fifth Head, but I think this is a good example of this early, more expansive style. Here, when he's being descriptive, you have the strong sense that something is going on where a lot is going on, where it is pregnant with meaning, in a way that having a few directions about the city is useful, but is not. It's not that all of this is going to come up in loads of detail for at any time soon. Some of it is relevant. Here, there's a question of who's he seeing here in this strange dreamlike sequence. You have some characters. Perhaps we need to look for them in the text, or perhaps not. And if not, that's even more interesting, because this is therefore either irrelevant, bizarre stuff. Oh, he just saw some people. That's fun, isn't it? Or something else is going on where they don't come up, and they may come up in the text, that's what you have to spot. But if they don't, and Wolfe would do both in different books, you have to then think, why is there a crowned king? And this, by the way, is very reminiscent in some ways of quite different scenes in That Hideous Strength of archangels descending on Earth by C.S. Lewis, and other things by Lewis. It has a very Lewisian sense, also of the mythological figures in Prince Caspian dancing in Trone with Aslan. But yes, you have this man with a full, and also of Wolfe's own work in Castleview. A man with a full beard, he's crowned like a king, he dances stiffly but with dignity. Either that relates to someone or something in the book, or it is telling us some greater thematic point, in a way that being able to see the orange roof from the cupola of the library does not. Basically, that you could argue up a little bit, but I think generally speaking you can't. So this, even where he's descriptive, he has learned the trick of density, and he's learned to be able to both be expansive as in his early days and sparse as in his middle days, whilst retaining that density. One thing also to note is outside of Book of the New Sun, and because I don't think this probably will constitute a separate discussion. I might discuss it to do with some of the narrative voice issues to do with Severian as a narrator particularly, and that particular gimmick of translation of a future dialect. Generally speaking, he doesn't use lots of complicated words. Yeah, you often sometimes find stuff that's complicated, but though Wolfe said he trusted his audience, he believed they could understand his books, he didn't mean because in let's say in a sort of, I love the poetic modernist, but he's not finding odd coinages and making a catena of Greek and Latin phrases that sort of you're just meant to be tested to read and work out. And that is very much a modernist assumption, is that poetry is there to test and press the reader. But Wolfe doesn't tend to do that. Instead of all of this, what's complicated here? Whitecaps are the tidal race's specialist language, I guess. I just need to get my pen up. Whitecaps of the tidal race is perhaps specialist. Starcrosser is specialist for the purpose of the world. And then here, telescope, no, nothing in that one. Here, nothing special. Flat, sorry, I should say nothing special except for the slang flat. And then here, Juno-esque. There's some very rich and powerful imagery here, but lean capering fellow who seemed all arms and legs, dorsal with the face of an ape, half-naked girl with flying hair. None of that is complicated. So generally speaking, Wolfe achieves these tricks of density and of vivid description, including here in this quite simple passage, just looking from the library cupola. He does it without using highly academic language. They're not overly long sentences. You can see, generally speaking, you're talking about just over a line length here, shorter here. And he doesn't rely on that side of things to make his stories complex. So when we come to look at some of the issues of theme, some of the issues of voice, we need to bear in mind that most of the time, with the one or two specific exceptions, Latro might come in the same kind of bag because of the mythological background. But we're still not talking about kind of complex prose necessarily. Book of the New Sun is the most obvious example of complex extra vocabulary. But yes, barring those, barring the solar cycle, we are not looking at a guy who uses complexity in style to make complex books. Instead, he's using a fairly clear style, generally speaking, to allow us to access quite complex, dense ideas. And as I say here, with these figures who we don't know who they are, whether or not they're relevant to the plot or whether or not they're thematic, it's a perfect example. Anyway, that's the end of what I want to say for today, just about some basic writing style issues for Gene Wolfe, just at the word and sentence level and paragraph level. If you've got any thoughts on this, please share it in the comments, and I will be back next month with something else. Till next time.